gather your cocoa. Return to the tree. It's time for more Nutcracker and the Mouse King. Chapter 7. The Story of the Hard Nut. Pirlipat's mother was the wife of a king, and therefore a queen, and Pirlipat straightway at the moment of her birth, a true princess. The king was beside himself with joy when he saw his beautiful daughter, as she lay in the cradle. He shouted aloud, danced and jumped about on one leg, and cried again, "Oh, was there ever anything more beautiful than my little Pirlipat?" Thereupon all the ministers, generals, presidents, and staff officers jumped about on one leg like the king, and cried aloud, "No, never!" And it was so, in truth, for as long as the world had been standing, a lovelier child was never born than the very Princess Pirlipat. Her little face seemed to be made of lilies and roses, delicate and white. Her eyes were of the sparkling azure, and it was charming to see how her little locks curled in bright golden ringlets. Besides this, Pirlipat had brought into the world 2 rows of little pearly teeth, with which 2 hours after her birth she bit into the High Chancellor's finger, as he was examining her features too closely, such that he screamed out, "Oh, Gemini!" Others assert that he screamed out, "Oh, Cricky," but on this point authorities are at the present day divided. Well, little Pirlipat bit the High Chancellor's finger, and the enraptured land knew that some sense dwelt within Pirlipat's beautiful body. As had been said, all were delighted. The queen alone was very anxious and uneasy, and no one knew wherefore, but everybody remarked with surprise the care at which she watched little Pirlipat's cradle. Besides, the doors were guarded by soldiers, and not counting the 2 nurses who always remained close by, 6 maids night after night sat in the room to watch. But what seemed very foolish, and no one could understand the meaning of, was this. Each of the 6 maids must have a cat upon her lap, and stroke it the whole night through, and thus keep it continually purring. It is impossible that you, dear listener, can guess why Pirlipat's mother made these arrangements, but I know, and will straightway tell you. It happened that once upon a time many great kings and fine princes were assembled at the court of Pirlipat's father, on which occasion much splendor was displayed. The theaters were crowded, balls were given, tournaments held almost every day. The king, in order to show how plainly it was that he was in no want of gold and silver, was resolved to take a good handful out of his royal treasury and expend it in a suitable manner. Therefore, as soon as he had been privately informed by the overseer of the kitchen that the court astronomer had predicted the right time for killing, he ordered a great feast of sausages, leapt into his carriage, and went himself to invite the assembled kings and princes to take a little stroll with him, in order to enjoy the agreeable surprise which he had prepared for them. Upon his return, he said very affectionately to the queen, "You know, my dear, how extremely fond I am of sausages." The queen knew at once what he meant by that, and it was this, that she should take upon herself, as she had always done before, the useful occupation of making sausages. The Lord Treasurer must straightway bring to the kitchen the great golden sausage kettle, and the silver chopping knives and stew pans. A large fire of sandalwood was made. The queen put on her damask apron, and soon the sweet smell of sausage meat began to steam out from the kettle. The agreeable odor penetrated even to the royal council chamber, and the king, seized with a sudden transport, could no longer restrain himself. "With your permission, my lords," he cried, and leapt up, ran as fast as he could to the kitchen, embraced the queen, stirred a little with his golden scepter in the kettle, and then his emotion being quieted, returned calmly to the council. The important moment had now arrived, when the fat was to be chopped into little pieces and browned gently in the silver stew pans. The maid of honor now retired, for the queen, out of true devotion and reverence for her spouse, wished to perform this duty alone. But just as it began to fry, a small whispering voice was heard. "Give me a little of the fat, sister. I should like my part of the feast too." I too am a queen. Give me a little of the fat." The queen knew very well that it was Lady Mouserings who said this. Lady Mouserings had lived these many years in the king's palace. She maintained that she was related to the royal family, and that she herself was a queen in the kingdom of Mouslia, for which she had held a great court under the hearth. The queen was a kind and benevolent lady, and although she was not exactly willing to acknowledge Lady Mouserings as a true queen and sister, she was very ready to allow her a little banquet on this great holiday. She answered therefore, "Come out then, Lady Mouserings. You are welcome to a little of the fat." Upon this, Lady Mouserings leapt out very quickly and merrily, jumped upon the hearth, and seized with her dainty little paws one piece of fat after the other as the queen reached it to her. But now, all the cousins and aunts of the Lady Mouserings came running, besides her 7 sons, rude and forward rogues who fell all at once upon the fat, and the terrified queen could not drive them away. But as good fortune would have it, the chief maid of honor came in at this moment and chased away the intruding guests, so that a little of the fat was left. The king's mathematician was summoned and demonstrated very clearly that there was enough remaining to season all the sausages. It was distributed with the nicest judgment and skill. Drums, trumpets were now heard without, and all the invited potentates and princes, some on white palfreys, some in crystal carriages, came in splendid apparel to the feast. The king received them kindly and graciously, and then, adorned with crown and scepter, as became the monarch of the land, seated himself at the head of the table. Already in the first course, that of the sausage balls, it was observed that he grew pale and paler. His eyes raised to heaven, gentle sighs escaped from his chest, and he seemed to undergo great inward suffering. But in the second course, which consisted of long sausages, he sat back upon his throne, sobbing and moaning, held both hands to his face, and at last wept and groaned aloud. All sprang up from the table. The royal physician tried in vain to feel the pulse of the unhappy monarch. A deep-seated, unknown torture appeared to agitate him. At last, and after much anxiety, and after the application of some very strong remedies, the king seemed to come to himself a little and stammered out the scarcely audible words, "Too little fat." The queen threw herself in despair at his feet and sobbed out, "Oh, my poor, unhappy royal husband, alas, how great must thy suffering be which you endure! But see the guilty one at your feet. Punish her without mercy. Alas, Lady Mouserings with her 7 sons and aunts and cousins have eaten up the fat," and with these words she fell right over backwards in a swoon. Then the king, full of rage, leapt up and cried out, "Chief maid of honor, how happened that?" The chief maid of honor told her story, as much as she knew of it, and the king resolved to take vengeance upon Lady Mouserings and her family for having eaten up the fat of the sausages. The Privy Council was called, and it was resolved to summon Lady Mouserings to trial and confiscate all her estates. But the king was of the opinion that in the meantime she might end up eating more of his sausage fat. The affair was placed at last in the hands of the royal watchmaker and mechanist. The man, whose name was the same as mine, to wit, Christian Elias Drosselmeier, engaged by means of a very singular and deep political scheme to drive Lady Mouserings and her family from the palace forever. He invented, therefore, several curious little machines in which a piece of toasted fat was fastened to a thread, and these Drosselmeier placed around the Mouserings' dwellings. Lady Mouserings was much too wise to not see through Drosselmeier's craft, but all her warnings and all her entreaties were of no avail, for every one of her 7 sons, and many of her cousins and aunts, all went into Drosselmeier's machines, and as they tried to snap away the food, were caught by an iron grating which suddenly fell down behind them, and were afterwards miserably slaughtered in the kitchen. Lady Mouserings, with the little remnants of her family, forsook the dreadful place. Grief, despair, revenge filled her bosom. The court reveled in joy at this event, but the queen was very anxious, for she knew of the disposition of Lady Mouserings, and was very sure that she would not suffer the death of her sons to go unavenged. In fact, Lady Mouserings appeared one day when the queen was in the kitchen, preparing a harslet hash for her royal husband, a dish of which she was very fond, and said, "My sons, my cousins, and aunts are destroyed. Take care, queen. That mouse queen does not bite thy little princess in two. Take good care." With this she disappeared and was not seen again. But the queen was so frightened that she let the hash fall into the fire, and thus a second time Lady Mouserings had spoiled a favorite dish for the king, at which he was very angry. "But this, dear children," said Drosselmeier, "is enough for tonight. The rest another time." Maria, who had her own thoughts about this story, begged Godfather Drosselmeier very hard to go on, but she could not prevail upon him. He rose, saying, "Too much at once is bad for the health. The rest tomorrow." As the counselor was just stepping out of the room, Fred called out, "Tell me, Godfather Drosselmeier, is it then really true that you invented mousetraps?" "How can you ask such a silly question?" asked his mother. But the counselor smiled mysteriously and said in an undertone, "Am I a skillful watchmaker, and yet not able to invent a mousetrap?" Chapter 8. The Story of the Hard Nut. Continued. "You know now, children," commenced Counselor Drosselmeier on the following evening, "why the queen took such great care in guarding the beautiful Princess Pirlipat. Was it not to be feared that Lady Mouserings would execute her threat, that she would come again and bite the little princess to death? Drosselmeier's machines were not the least protection against the wise and prudent Lady Mouserings, but the court astronomer, who was at the same time private stargazer and fortune-teller to His Majesty, declared it would be his opinion that the family of Baron Purr would be able to keep Lady Mouserings from the cradle. Most of that name were secretaries of legation at court, with little to do, though always at hand for an embassy of a foreign power. But they must now render themselves useful at home, and thus it came that each of the waiting women must hold a son of that family upon her lap, and, by continual and attentive petting, lighten the severe public duties which fell to their lot. Late one night, the two chief nurses who sat down by the cradle started up out of a deep sleep. All around lay in quiet slumber, no purring, the stillness of the grave. Even the death watch could be heard ticking. And what was the terror of the two chief waiting women as they just saw before them a large, dreadful mouse which stood erect on its hind feet and had laid its ugly head close against the face of the princess. With a cry of terror they jumped up. All awoke, but in a moment Lady Mouserings, for the great mouse by Pirlipat's cradle was none other than she, ran as fast as they could to the corner of the chamber. The secretaries of legation leapt after her, but it was too late. She had disappeared through a hole in the chamber floor. Little Pirlipat awoke at the noise and wept bitterly. "Oh, thank heavens," cried the nurse. "She lives, she lives." But how great was their terror when they looked at Pirlipat and saw what a change had taken place in the sweet and beautiful child. Instead of the white face with red cheeks and golden locks, a large ill-shaped head sat upon her thin, shriveled body. Her azure blue eyes were changed into green, staring ones, and her little mouth had stretched itself from ear to ear. The queen was brought to death's door by grief and sorrow, and it was found necessary to hang the king's library with thick wadded tapestry, for again and again he ran his head against the wall, crying out at every lamentable tone, "Oh me, unhappy monarch, woe is me!" He might now have seen how much better it would have been to eat his sausages without fat, and to leave Lady Mouserings and her family at peace under the hearth. But Pirlipat's royal father did not think of this. He laid all the blame upon the court watchmaker and mechanist, Christian Elias Drosselmeier of Nuremberg. He therefore wisely decided that Drosselmeier should restore the Princess Pirlipat to her former condition within 4 weeks, or at least find out some certain and infallible method of effecting this. Otherwise he should suffer a shameful death under the axe of the executioner. Drosselmeier was not the least bit terrified. He had great confidence in his skill and good fortune, and began immediately with the first operation he thought would be useful. He took the princess apart with great dexterity, unscrewed her little hands and feet carefully, examining her inward structure, but he found that, alas, the princess would grow uglier as she grew bigger, and knew not what to do or advise. He put the princess carefully together again and sank down by her cradle in despair, for he was not allowed to leave it. The 4th week had commenced, yes. Thursday had come when the king looked in with flashing eyes, shaking his scepter at him, and cried, "Christian Elias Drosselmeier, cure the princess, or thou must die." Drosselmeier began to weep bitterly, but the princess lay as happy as the day, and cracked nuts. Pirlipat's uncommon appetite for nuts now occurred for the first time to the mechanist, and, likewise, the fact that she had come into the world with teeth. In truth, immediately after her transformation, she had screamed continually until a nut came in her way, which she immediately put in her mouth, cracked, and ate the kernel, and then became quite composed. Since that time, her nurses found nothing pleased her so well as to be supplied with nuts. O sacred instinct of nature, eternal, inexplicable sympathy of existence, cried Christian Elias Drosselmeier, thou pointest me to the gates of this mystery. I will knock, and they will open. He begged straightway for permission to speak with the royal astronomer, and was led to his apartment under a strong guard. They embraced with many tears, for they had been warm friends, then retired into a private cabinet and examined a great many books which treated of instinct, of sympathies, antipathies, and other mysterious things. Night came on. The astronomer looked at the stars, and with the aid of Drosselmeier, who had great skill in such matters, set up the horoscope of Pirlipat. It was a great deal of trouble, for the lines grew all the while more and more intricate, but at last, what joy! At last it became quite clear that the Princess Pirlipat, in order to be freed from the magic which had deformed her, to regain her beauty, had to do nothing but eat the kernel of the nut Krakatuk. Now the nut Krakatuk had such a hard shell that an 840-pounder might be wheeled over it without breaking. This hard nut must be cracked with the teeth before the princess by a man who had never been shaved and had never worn boots. The young man must then hand her the kernel with closed eyes, and must not open them again until he marched 7 steps backwards without stumbling. Drosselmeier and the astronomer had labored together without cessation for 3 days and nights, and the king was seated at dinner on Sunday afternoon when the mechanist, who was to have been beheaded early Monday morning, rushed in with joy and transport and proclaimed that he had found a method of restoring Pirlipat to her lost beauty. The king embraced him with great kindness and promised him a diamond sword, 4 orders of honor, and 2 new Sunday suits. Immediately after dinner we will go to work, he added, and see to it, dear mechanist, that the unshorn young man in shoes is ready at hand with the Krakatuk. And take care that he drinks no wine beforehand, for fear he should stumble as he goes the 7 steps backwards like a crab. After that he may drink like a fish. Drosselmeier was very much discomposed at these words, and, after much stammering and stuttering, said that though the method was discovered indeed, the nut Krakatuk and the young man to crack it were yet to be sought after, and that it was quite doubtful whether nut or nutcracker would ever be found. The king, in great anger, swung his scepter about his crowned head and roared with the voice of a lion, "Then off goes thy head." It was very fortunate for the unhappy Drosselmeier that the king's dinner had been cooked better than usual this day, so that he was in a pleasant humor and disposed to listen to reason, while the good queen, who was moved by the hard fate of the mechanist, used her influence to soothe him. Drosselmeier then after a while took courage and represented to the monarch that he had performed his task in discovering a means to restore the beauty of the princess, and thus by terms of the royal decree had secured his safety. The king said that was all trash, stupid stuff, nonsense, but resolved at last that the watchmaker should leave the court instantly, accompanied by the royal astronomer, and never return without the Nutcracker in his pocket. By the intercession of the queen, he had consented that the Nutcracker might be summoned by a notice in all the home and foreign newspapers and journals. Here the counselor broke off again and promised to narrate the rest on the following evening.